Welcome viewers, Dr. JWAU. What happens when people begin protesting the movement, the very movement that claims to be protecting them? For years, much of the world's attention has focused on the conflict between Israel and Hamas. For far less attention has been given to the voices of ordinary Gazans who have publicly challenged Hamas despite the enormous personal risk. And here in Australia, we've got these Hamas people, protesters. They call themselves pro-Palestinian protesters, but they're just Hamas supporters, upsetting all dimensions of community when they start their business. Just last week, they interrupted a charity formal event out the front protesting. Reports of hundreds of Gazans gathering in protest, demanding an end to war, repression and suffering against Hamas reveal a different side of the conflict, one in which civilians find themselves caught between armed confrontation, economic collapse, and internal political control. According to multiple reports, these demonstrations have been met with intimidation, arrests, and threats of murder and violent crackdowns by Hamas security forces.
Turning to Gaza now, hundreds of Palestinians took to the streets of Gaza on Friday to protest the Hamas terror group in a rare public display. But before the demonstrations even started, Hamas started issuing threats. Protests had been planned across 18 locations throughout the Strip on June 26, with Gazans calling for Hamas to disarm and to hand over power to a transitional authority. But those who did turn out encountered Hamas gunmen at every intersection, a religious ruling declaring the protests forbidden, and explicit warnings that anyone who showed up or even posted about it online would be treated as a collaborator with Israel and executed on the spot. Multiple arrests, beatings, and death threats apparently quelled the unrest. And according to our next guest, Gaza-born activist Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib, some were interrogated and placed under arrest inside Al-Ahli Arab Hospital, also known as the Baptist Hospital, which Hamas is now using as an operations base. That is the same hospital that a faulty Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket struck early in the war, killing hundreds, an attack that the New York Times then falsely attributed to the state of Israel. I'd like to turn now to Ahmed Fouad al-Khatib for more on this. He's an analyst and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Now, you personally said that Hamas is using Al-Ahli Hospital, a place that is meant to treat the sick and wounded, as an interrogation center. Tell us what actually happened during these protests, what we know about how many people actually turned out. At first, there were reports that people were too scared to go to the streets. What actually played out?
Certainly. Well, unfortunately, some of the footage that's been circulating is inaccurate in the sense that it's from previous anti-Hamas protests from last year. And so what had happened is that Hamas had fully mobilized both its governance apparatus, the security services of Hamas's government, as well as the terror militias of the Al-Qassam brigades, the guys that actually carried out October 7th. Joined by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which offered and volunteered to provide additional firepower and manpower to suppress any protests that were designated to highlight the suffering, the hardships, the challenges that people were facing throughout Gaza, and calling for an end to Hamas's rule, which the majority of Gaza's population has come to recognize as the main obstacle for a transition that could usher in reconstruction and the incoming of the NCAG, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the Technocratic Committee. And so what happened is Hamas fully mobilized its media apparatuses, its security apparatuses, not just the Al-Ahli Hospital, where individual friends of mine were actually detained, tortured, and forced to commit to not participating in these demonstrations on Friday, June 26th, but the entirety of Gaza's medical infrastructure, including the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir el-Balah and Nasser Hospital in southern Gaza, were also utilized for interrogation and security repression of the protesters. And so, unfortunately, there was little to no protests on Friday as intended because of the sheer terror and the just blanketing of Gaza, thousands and thousands of terror operatives that prevented people from taking to the streets.
So ultimately, to clarify, these videos that we saw going viral on social media were actually from previous protests, and people ultimately were too scared to take to the streets because of this mass mobilization, you could say, of what is left of Hamas on the ground.
Correct. And there were small gatherings of, I would say, no more than 100 that were very, in a couple of spaces, that were very quickly quelled, and a bunch of people were arrested. But we did not actually see demonstrations occur, and that is very that is what is accurate and what unfolded, and that's unfortunately how Hamas has succeeded in repressing these protests.
You know, I just have to say, obviously, this paints a very dire picture on the ground in terms of the power that Hamas still has. Would you say that, you know, these planned protests are reflective of the wider Gazan population, or that this is rather a smaller portion of the population that is unhappy with Hamas?
Without a doubt, I stand by my assessment that the majority of Gaza's population are against Hamas for different reasons. And just being against Hamas doesn't mean you're pro-Israel. It doesn't mean you're not upset with what happened after October 7th, the Israeli response, etc. But I'm saying that as to identify an opening.
Right.
Nevertheless, the majority of the population are very clear. Hamas is the obstacle to reconstruction. It's the obstacle to a better life and a better future. Hamas is the reason why people continue to live in tents, in miserable housing accommodations, with trash everywhere, with sewer, with rodents, with infestations, because no donor countries, not the Arabs, not the Europeans, not anybody is going to invest a penny in reconstruction with the risk that Hamas could simply launch another war 5-10 years from now. And all indications point to Hamas re-entrenching itself, attempting to remanufacture itself, even as it offers token measures of giving up some control here, some surrendering of government apparatuses here. The tunnels are still present. Hamas is maintaining its guns, and Hamas has no intention of relinquishing control over Gaza. So yes, the protests very much so are representative of, I would say, a dominant perspective in Gaza. However, people are terrified. I mean, imagine people in North Korea or people in Putin's Russia or in Lukashenko's Belarus trying to voice their opposition. And Friday is a good indication of just how dangerous it can be.
Well, Ahmed, I'd like to thank you for joining us as per usual. Fascinating to hear what you have to say.
Viewers, the history of conflict is not written only by armies. It's also written by ordinary people who decide that fear should no longer determine their future. Whether these demonstrations represent the beginning of lasting political change or a brief moment of public defiance remains uncertain. What is clear is that voices from within Gaza have added another dimension to a conflict too often understood only through military headlines. Understanding this reality requires careful attention to evidence, competing narratives, and the experiences of civilians whose lives continue to be shaped by violence, governance, and uncertainty under Hamas. Thank you for watching. If you value evidence-based historical and geographical documentaries that examine complex events with depth and context, consider subscribing and joining discussion below.